Welcome to Dick Morris Democracy. I'm Dick Morris. A white prison guard in Colorado Springs, Josh Young, is suing the state, saying that the diversity, equity, and inclusion training he was required to undergo created a toxic work environment that drove him to quit his job after 5 years as a correction officer. He grew tired of learning that he's a racist and has been ever since birth, that he can't help it and that he needs to watch himself closely so he doesn't act inequitably toward African American inmates. He was taught that all whites are racist and that they perpetuate white supremacy, that the very notion of race was invented by white people to justify the oppression of people of color, that white supremacy is an ever-present feature of daily life in the United States, and that whites who deny their own racism are merely fragile racists who cannot accept their own prejudice. This lawsuit is important because it's one of a great many that are about to deluge the courts as white people fight against government-ordered reverse discrimination and anti-white racism. The Biden administration bases its programs and priority on race, but the U.S. Constitution does not. The 14th Amendment clearly prohibits any law which shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Memo to the Biden people and the crazy left that pulls their strings. White people are people too. The law is supposed to be colorblind. But after a century and a half of laws and regulations that discriminated against African Americans and other minorities, the table has turned. And the Biden administration is now passing programs that blatantly discriminate against white people. The ideological justification for this reversion to racial discrimination lies in the semantic difference between equality and equity. After Dr. Martin Luther King, we adopted equality as a guiding principle as a nation. Bob Dylan wrote, "Equality, I spoke the word as if a wedding vow." And then he adds, "I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now." But equality isn't good enough for the left. They say that the discrimination of the past has left so many scars on generations of African Americans and so much bias in the psyche of whites that only reverse discrimination can heal it. They call that equity. But equity for who? Not for Joshua, who has to hear from his boss and coworkers how responsible he is for the racism of generations that came before. In the mandatory racial sensitivity training that he had to undergo, he was told over and over that his whiteness was an issue. Josh was told, "I can't help it. Racial prejudice, from which I've always prided myself on not feeling, has been with me since my birth, and that I have constantly to watch myself and check myself to keep it down." It's the secular equivalent of original sin. Josh says that this inculcation of the idea that the guards in prison are racist made it almost impossible to discipline inmates without provoking charges of racism that might lead to hearings, discipline of the guards, not of the inmates, or even dismissal. He points out that racism reigns supreme among inmates at most prisons. When they walk in the prison door, they immediately separate themselves and join gangs based on their race. Sureños for Latinos, Aryan Nation for whites, and Blood and Crips for blacks. Josh says we try to counter the idea that everything is racial. We try to get them to think about people apart from skin color. But when the state says that race is the most important thing, it's very hard to overcome. Josh talks about how the racial blinders the state wears make it hard to do his job. If a fight breaks out, we have to work hard and swing into action to stop it from becoming a riot. But when our relationship with the inmates is compromised because the government keeps reminding them that we're racist and can't help it, how are we supposed to enforce discipline? Then there's the drug problem. We have to be sure contraband doesn't come into our prison. That means that we have to police the inmates and their visitors to make sure they're not passing drugs. So we have to prohibit hugging or holding hands, even between spouses. Well, that leads them to question whether we're picking on them because of race or something. We get second-guessed when we shouldn't be. And among the prison staff, Josh says, we have to have each other's backs. Our safety, even our lives, depend on it. But when you inject race into it and tell a black guard that I'm a racist who exploits him, how can we be sure we can count on each other? A big part of the problem with racial sensitivity training is that it teaches guards to spy on one another for instances of racism. They stress that we have to tell on each other, and that plays havoc with the trust we need to have in the guy next to us. The government makes us look at everything, through a lens of racism.